You know what I hate? People talking about things they think are awesome. It's like, what am I supposed to do? Agree with you? Oh, actually, you know what? Putting cinnamon honey on nanners probably would take me to heaven. Turns out it is a place on earth. Maybe listening to positivity is the way to go. But what about the NES? Seems like everyone has good things to say about the NES. Or at least it used to be that way. Nowadays it seems people mostly say good things about it. Mostly, which means that some people don't say nice things about it, which mostly seems to be from fatigue. I hear stuff like, I'm tired of people covering NES games. I'm tired of people talking about the NES. And don't worry, I'm not talking about the NES. I'm talking about people talking about the NES, at least for now. Granted, it sure seems like ever since people online started talking about older video games, the NES has certainly been a major focal point, in large part thanks to AVGN. Could we argue YouTube was invented so we can cover NES and watch cat videos? It makes sense to me. Cats do silly stuff and the NES plays a lot of great games. But as good as people might think the NES is, there is a very natural and understandable desire to see other video game consoles covered as well. And they have been, I sure have, and others have just the same. Most of you know how this works. You don't just get into the NES and say, alright, I'm good. No, you start getting into other consoles. NES is like the starter pack for video game obsession. One second you're playing NES games from your childhood, the next you're driving 3 hours to the house of a guy your uncle once knew who has a CRT TV for free so you can flip it onto its side to play vertical Japanese shoot-'em-ups in their proper arcade orientation, am I right? Anybody talking about consoles online has likely gone through a journey, and therefore will cover other systems as well. And sure, there's some starved Acorn Archimedes and Nokia N-Gage fans out there who'd like more coverage, but let me ask you this. When you were a little kid, would you have ever dreamt that decades into the future you'd be able to look up a video detailing the 3 different types of PlayStation long box cases? Well, thanks to longtime viewer of the channel Good Vibe Collecting, you can. Point is, as much coverage of the NES as there is, the YouTube community has covered a lot of different things, and I don't mean to brag, but with how much I spoil you all with my bread bag clip collection, at a certain point being humble just goes right out the window. That said, the even bigger point is that people talking about how great the NES is so much should hardly be something that counts against its greatness. If people kept telling me that a restaurant was really good, it wouldn't make me start to think, well, maybe it's kind of nasty. A console doesn't get talked about a ton without doing some things right, and in the case of the NES, being home to some of the most iconic and what many would call best games ever made. And for those who might say the NES is a nostalgia thing, well, nostalgia is a positive feeling, and personally, I only have nostalgia for good things. Shocker, but I don't have nostalgia for my grade school PE teacher's morning breath. I'd say, what's wrong with a splash of nostalgia contributing to a console's greatness, so long as it's not the only thing, which, for the NES, I think it clearly is not. Personally, at times when I feel like I've gotten my fill of NES talk, I counter with some NES playing. That's right, with how much hype there is around talking about NES games, reliving some of the nostalgia and collecting the games, sometimes people can forget about actually playing them. You know, the experience that made people fall in love with the console to begin with. And it's an experience that I find to be unique in a couple different key ways that I find helps it continue to be great both now and into the future, being how well known the games are. Hard to imagine future generations forgetting the original Super Mario Brothers, as well as how challenging the games are. Hard to imagine there not always being people letting you know they can beat Battletoads. I sure won't. That is, once I've actually done it. You see, more than any other console, the NES has what I like to call I beat that game games. Battletoads is an I beat that game game. Ninja Gaiden is an I beat that game game. Saving some for later instead of devouring an entire box of Girl Scout cookies at once is an I beat that game game. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is an I beat that game game. You want proof? For those who have beaten them, when I mentioned each of those games, you said in your head, I beat that game. Come to think of it, I actually haven't beaten any of these games, or that one, but I have beaten Ghosts and Goblins twice through, and believe me, sometimes when I'm feeling down, I remember and it gives me a huge shot of confidence. So there you go, kids, beat some of these NES games and this could be you, a confidence machine. And yeah, I know that a lot of younger kids can initially be turned off by the difficulty of NES games, perhaps even dismissing them as this is just crazy stuff that geezers used to do. Can't even say that's wrong either. Raise your hand if beating one of these games felt like it drove you nuts. It's not just about the challenge though. Heck, some might argue that beating Contra with the Contra code makes it feel more authentic. Just pressing start at the menu screen could feel like something's missing. Additionally, these days a lot of people use save states, and I think people just generally like to say they've experienced iconic games all the way through, and along the way they come to find they really enjoyed that game, contributing to their opinion of maybe thinking the console it's on is great. How often does somebody play through Super Mario Bros. 3 and think, well, that was garbage? I'm sure someone in the comments will let us know, but in general, this game has a high satisfaction rate. Some even say it's still the best Mario game ever made, and not even as an insult to some of the brilliant Mario games that have come out since. Mario 3 is just that good. Nailed it all the way back then. From what I've seen just surveying the landscape of people's opinions, and something I've found myself agreeing with is that the NES marked a point in gaming that many find tolerable to go back to. Sorry, Atari, but as much as you can certainly get enjoyment out of games that came prior to the NES seems to mark a pretty clear point of delineation for a lot of people in terms of when their gaming journey really took off. As obnoxious as it would be to pretend that NES was the first console there was, the popularity of the NES can make it kind of feel that way sometimes, with there being a huge delta in terms of the interest in the NES and any of the consoles that came before it. The NES just hit differently when it came along, and still does. Yep, still feels good. And plenty of people feel like they wouldn't have the same love for video games that they do today without it. And yes, I know in Europe it was a different story, but nowadays I think plenty of European video game enthusiasts have taken a liking to the console in their own way. In any case, I don't think the NES has become any less great over the years, but rather that its reputation has simply changed and will continue to change. The beginning of YouTube, as well as the initial boom in popularity of retro gaming, brought with it a very unique flavor of energy surrounding the NES in particular. And while the hype may not quite be the same, there's still a lot of positive feelings, even if there is perhaps a bit of fatigue for some. But like all things, I'd say take a break, and after some time that fatigue may start to fade and the games feel fresh again. As more people come into the hobby, new people provide new perspectives, and the aura around a console develops as time passes. Younger generations will venture into gaming's past, with the NES being one of the consoles us older folks will always point to for those curious to give them a shot. I really do think that the biggest barrier between a great console and people coming around to thinking it's great is just actually playing the console and giving it a fair shot. Just ask the Sega Saturn. Way too many games that people are over the moon about on this thing to not say it's a great console in my opinion. So with the NES being such a flagship console in gaming's history, combined with games I believe are timeless, not all, but some, I think this console will continue to be great. But there we have it for my thoughts. As always, I'd be curious what all of you think. So with that, let me know in the comments, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah, and he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird.